Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. So the visible and the invisible, this is the 9th video, and we are still in interrogation and dialectic. We're going to finish up this chapter today, and the subsection that we're going to finish up with is called perceptual faith and interrogation. And basically the guiding question for this little section is, what is the meaning of our question before the world? And that's really, it links back to the subheading here, interrogation, perceptual faith and interrogation. It just connects in with that. We're asking not whether the world exists, but what it is for it to exist. And so that's kind of where this subsection, I think it's only about 5 pages, if I remember correctly, in the book. So it's not a huge section, but that's where Merleau-Ponty kind of will take us in this part. So the first part of the video is called language. And so we've established that our question is not whether the world exists, but what it is for it to exist. And Merleau-Ponty asks here, can this question be addressed? Can it be answered by language? So first up, what is language? It is not, Merleau-Ponty says, a system of inert signs which unambiguously refer to significations whose meaning they completely and fully contain. And that's important to understand because that is how we tend to think of language. We just imagine, there's a sign, it connects, it signifies something, and it's just this nice one-to-one connection. It lets us express thoughts that we already have. It's just a way of notate. It's just a form of notation, putting ideas and thoughts that are already formed into the external world, so that we can communicate with other people. But Merleau-Ponty is saying that's not what it is. Rather, the univocal signification is but one part of the signification of the word. Beyond it, there is always a halo of signification that manifests itself in new and unexpected modes of use. So, again, language is not a simple one-to-one signified relation. This is only a part of what language is. There is, and I like that expression, there's a halo of signification that manifests itself. And if you think about language, that is exactly what it is. It is ambiguous. There is one word can refer to multiple things, and the meaning of that word can change depending on the words that surround it, its context. So the way we use language it's not this simple way of kind of indexing our thoughts, of taking what's inside in our heads and putting it outside. It's not as simple as that. There's more going on, and it means that language is creative, and that's really Merleau-Ponty's point. Rather than simply codifying what we already think, it helps us to think in the first place. We think original thoughts through language, with language. It's not that we have an already complete thought which we then are trying to present through language. Rather, the language is the working out of that thought. Not always, obviously, but that's its creative use. The idea is that there's more to language than just taking what's inside and presenting it outside. And Merleau-Ponty talks more about this in the another book that he didn't finish, The Prose of the World. And Derrida also makes a huge study of the sign and the signified, the signifier and the signified. So Far from harboring the secret of the being of the world, language is itself a world, itself a being and a being to the second power, since it does not speak in a vacuum, since it speaks of being and of the world, and therefore redoubles their enigma instead of dissipating it. So language it's a being within being, a world within the world, hence a world or being to the second power, and it refers to being and to world, and which therefore precede language, hence the redoubling. It redoubles the enigma rather than dissipating it. So language is not the answer to the meaning of our question before the world. It doesn't answer the question, what is it for the world to exist? Because language is itself a world within this greater world, a world to the second power. And this critique applies beyond language, not just to language, but to any kind of signification in general. There is always a horizon of brute being and of brute mind from which the constructed objects and the significations emerge and which they do not account for. And this horizon of brute being and brute mind from which our language, or signification in general, emerge is precisely what Merleau-Ponty is interested in this book. And it's to that we're going to turn in the next section, which is called The Horizon. So just going back to Sartre and his philosophy for a moment. Sartre, Merleau-Ponty says, seeks to understand openness, so openness upon being or upon the world, through this dialectical opposition of being and nothingness. But Merleau-Ponty wants to reverse this. So rather than understanding openness through being and nothingness, he says it's only through openness that we can understand being and nothingness. So we have to address this openness first, because the being and nothingness is an abstraction carved out of that. And if we start with the abstraction, we can never get back to this original openness, which is the root that Merleau-Ponty is looking for, that ontological foundation. So in Sartre, I, as nothingness, visit being in itself, which remains distant because nothingness, the anonymous one in me that sees, pushes before itself a zone of void where being no longer only is, but is seen. It is therefore my constitutive nothingness that makes the distance from being as well as its proximity, the perspective as distinct from the thing itself, that constitutes the limits of my field into limits. So the being that Sartre finds is always a being which is seen, because it appears courtesy of this negation that the for itself introduces. That's that what Merleau-Ponty called the zone of void in that quote, and what Sartre calls the way the for itself secretes a nothingness. And it's that which allows being to be, but it's being never is then, it's always, rather, being is seen. So it always appears as a result of this nothingness approaching, this nothingness coming forward and being filled by being. So this is openness upon the world, upon being, grasped through a dialectical interplay. So I call them local abstractions of being and nothingness, but two points that have been taken out of an original ontological being. And again, starting from that, makes it impossible to get back to the original. And this means if we follow this path, if we start with that dialectical opposition, the nothingness I am is constitutive, establishing both the distance and the proximity of being, as well as constituting the limits of my field as limits. So I can cross those limits, I can go to the whole because I'm nothing, but if I do that, openness disappears because there is, as Merleau-Ponty says, no longer a labour of the look against its limits. Because if you go beyond those limits that you have as nothingness, you have established, then you lose engagement. There's no engagement anymore. There's just a thing. There's just a totality, but there's no interaction. You lose what makes the world, or a thing. Basically, the philosophy of negativity creates the boundaries or the structure within which experience can occur, within which the world can be seen, and this is the dialectic. But then, precisely because of the nature of that dialectical structure, it can't go beyond, because beyond it, there is nothing. There is no experience. There is no thing. There is no world. There's no longer any something and no longer openness. Hence, the unrealizable in itself, for itself, whole, that Sartre identifies. He talks about that, right? The whole, the in itself, for itself, but this is an unrealizable dream, if you like, of the for itself, because at that point you lose that engagement, you lose that interaction, which is the whole driving force of Sartre's philosophy, this interplay between a nothingness and being. Another way of thinking about this, another possible interpretation, is that instead of Sartre trying to understand openness, which is understood as ontology the way that Merleau-Ponty sees it in this book, instead of trying to understand openness through being and nothingness, the way that Merleau-Ponty claims, is that Sartre is or was trying to understand experience, as we said, with more penetration than had ever been done before, And so this is like a focus on phenomenology, but a focus then through a kind of local ontology, if you like, an ontology that is centered on this dialectical opposition, being and nothingness. But it's an ontological structure which aims at a deeper explication of experience, a deeper understanding or description of experience. That is, it has a phenomenological aim. And so he's not attempting the kind of global ontology, if you like, which would understand how that dialectical structure itself arose, which would be to come at the problem with an ontological focus. So essentially Sartre's ontology lies in service to phenomenology, whereas Merleau-Ponty uses phenomenology in service to his ontology. And that's why I said a couple of videos back that I think there is a sense in which some of Merleau-Ponty's criticisms of Sartre miss the mark a little bit, because he assumes, or he reads Sartre as doing the same thing that he's doing, engaged in the same project. And I don't think he necessarily was. It's more, like I say, his ontological structures, being and nothingness, were used to flesh out and to really describe our phenomenological experience, what it is to be a human being in the world, rather than addressing that world itself. And that's the focus that Merleau-Ponty has in this book. So, bottom line of Merleau-Ponty's criticism here is that the for itself as constitutive is accorded more power or freedom than it really has. In truth, this freedom remains secretly bound. We can only displace our look, that is, transfer its limits elsewhere. But it is necessary that there be always a limit. What is won on one side must be lost from the other. The openness upon the world implies that the world be and remain a horizon. Not because my vision would push the world back beyond itself, but because somehow he who sees is of it and is in it. So this is a really nice passage with quite an interesting and important idea. The for itself can only displace its look. It can only apply those limits, boundaries, or that structure to a different content, in a different context. But it always looks, and it always looks within limits, boundaries, or that structure. And that's the key for Merleau-Ponty, that the for itself is not an absolute freedom. It has this restriction, it is always looking. Even when you can turn your look somewhere else, but you're still looking. That look, that engagement is always there. And it's that which means that openness upon the world, a perspective, experience, requires that the world be and remain a horizon, i.e. something within which the for itself constitutes its limits, something which he who sees is of it and is in it, as Merleau-Ponty said. The world, that openness upon the world, and that the fact that we are always an openness upon the world. That is what we are. We have no option but to be an openness upon the world. And that means that the world that we are open to always remains a horizon. It always presents itself as a wider field within which we can direct our focus, if you like, within which we can, using those limits, those boundaries, that structure, we can focus. But wherever we focus, the world is always around us. It always surrounds us. And no matter where we turn, no matter where we direct our look or our gaze, the world is that horizon. And so that's the important point. The world is the horizon, and it is this way because the subject who sees is of the world and in it. And that idea is going to get a lot more interesting later. And it's getting close to what Merleau-Ponty will call that chiasm a little bit later. The idea that we're in the world and of the world, and it's because of that we're open to the world. Okay, so let's look at the last part of the video, which is the longest as well, interrogation. So I'm going to start this section off with a quote. Philosophy, therefore, does not seek to analyze our relationship with the world, to undo it as if it had been formed by assemblage, but it also does not terminate by an immediate and all-inclusive acknowledgement of being, of which there would be nothing more to say. Philosophy remains a question. It interrogates the world and the thing. It revives, repeats, or imitates their crystallization before us. So the first half of that is so Bergsonian I can hardly stand it. It's philosophy is not a dissection. We're not looking at parts which could be assembled or which have been assembled and it would therefore be abstractions. Nor is philosophy a vague, all-inclusive, but at the same time mysterious and empty whole, which has gone by various names throughout the history of philosophy: being, substance. These days, the in vogue term is consciousness, anything like that. If you're either breaking reality up into parts, or breaking the world up into parts, or trying to slap a label on the whole thing, you're not going the route that Merleau-Ponty wants to take. And that's a very Bergsonian idea anyway. Just wanted to point that out. But the second half is interesting as well, because philosophy, he says, now is a question. It's an interrogation. He's certainly not the first person to say that, but this is, when I read this again, it just, the immediate association that came to mind was Deleuze, difference in repetition. He talks about interrogation, questioning a lot, which is in exactly the same way that Merleau-Ponty talks about it here. And later, Merleau-Ponty even forbids us to speak in philosophy of a solution, which is even more reminiscent of Deleuze for me. So essentially, every crystallization that takes place before us in our openness upon the world admits of further crystallizations. In other words, it's never completed. So philosophy, as this questioning, as this constant interrogation of the world, is always discovering new things. It's always uncovering new ways of thinking about the world, ways of understanding the world. The world always appears in different ways because philosophy is fundamentally an interrogation upon the world. And that's what this openness upon the world means. It is an interrogation, a questioning. It's never static. Or if it's static, it moves in epochs, if you like, or eras. And but that's a progression that has no ending. It's not moving towards a final ultimate goal, ultimate truth, ultimate reality, because philosophy, that's not what philosophy is. It's not what philosophy does. Philosophy is not looking to uncover a capital T truth, which would be the end of philosophy. Philosophy, practiced properly, Merleau-Ponty is saying, is an interrogation fundamentally. It's ever creative. It's always understanding the world in different ways. It's always bringing new insights, interpreting the world in different ways. And that's a word that's been used a lot, right? It's fundamentally interpreting what is there, and it never stops. And that's why there is no end to philosophy. But that doesn't mean it's worthless. We in the modern era, we particularly think in our scientific age that every problem has a solution, and if you're not moving towards that solution, then you're not doing anything of worth. But that's exactly what philosophy, Merleau-Ponty is saying, I 100% agree with him, is that philosophy isn't that kind of thing. It's not moving towards a solution. It's not trying to uncover an ultimate truth, because philosophy itself is this way that we are open upon the world. It's an attempt to perhaps understand how we are open upon the world, but that openness itself is always evolving, always changing. And then Merleau-Ponty goes on to say, now then, we can see how the world comes about. It takes form under the domination of certain structural laws. Events let rather general powers show through. Powers such as the gaze or the word, which operate according to an identifiable style, according to if-then relationships, according to a logic in action. So the world that we live in and experience, the world that we're open to, arises out of these structural laws. The way that general powers, for example, the gaze, the word, the gaze and the word, affect a style. And it's this is what it means to be open to the world. This is what it means to be a question, fundamentally, an interrogation, an interpretation. And that's what we are, and we'll circle back to that idea at the end of the video. But the being that Merleau-Ponty is after is this whole process. This is what Merleau-Ponty is trying to understand in this book. The way this process plays out. How it is that we can be open to the world in this way. So what philosophy does then is, rather than decomposing our relationship with the world into supposedly real elements, pieces that could be assembled into a coherent whole, and I love this expression, it discerns articulations in the world, i.e. the style, the general powers, those structural laws that Merleau-Ponty mentions in that quote, those features that allow the world to appear as a world. So I'll just say that again because I like that expression. The goal of philosophy is not to uncover a final capital T truth. Understand is not to zero in on a final element, which is the building block of everything. Rather, it discerns articulations in the world. It identifies how our openness upon the world is formed, how it is articulated, how the mechanics, if you like, of that engagement, of that openness, the way that it penetrates the world, and in doing so, makes it a world. And that's the goal of philosophy. So it's never going to end up in a final, ultimate truth, because this way of articulating the world is always changing. It's always variable. It's always evolving. But not evolving towards, that makes it sound like it's moving towards some final point or heading in a certain direction, and it's probably not as organized or as deliberate as that. It's always changing, and it's that Merleau-Ponty wants to understand. So this means that philosophy has nothing to do with cognition, because being in the world are not for the philosopher unknowns, such as are to be determined through their relation with known terms. And this is another important idea. So cognition is basically the idea, the following, staying close to Merleau-Ponty's text. Cognition is the converting of unknowns into knowns via reason and logic and that kind of approach. But this can never tell us about being or the world, because anything completely known, anything perfectly defined, wholly understood or thoroughly explicated would have been stripped of precisely what makes it the being or the world that it is. If you can eliminate all of the unknowns, you're left not with perfect understanding, you're left with nothing. You've taken away you've removed the world. You've removed all of the elements that make the world the world. Because the world, and we're going to talk about this in a moment, the world requires those unknowns. It requires those gaps, those fissures in being that we've talked about before, those lacunae. It needs those spaces in order to be a world. If you fill in all of the gaps, fill in all of the unknowns, you're not left with perfect knowledge. You're not left with anything, because you in taking away all of those things, you take away what makes the world the world. So cognition here, which aims to understand fully, to remove all the unknowns, to answer all the questions, that endeavor, could it be successful, that endeavor would eliminate the world, it would destroy it. Rather than give you perfect knowledge, it would render the idea of knowledge impossible. So philosophy is not about cognition. And kind of along the same lines, I'm going to throw down a massive quote, and then I'll point out a few key points. But the quote is nice, so I thought I'd quote the whole thing for you. The object of philosophy will never come to fill in the philosophical question, since this obturation would take from it the depth and the distance that are essential to it. The effective, present, ultimate and primary being, the thing itself, are in principle apprehended in transparency through their perspectives, offer themselves therefore only to someone who wishes not to have them but to see them, not to hold them as with forceps or to immobilize them as under the objective of a microscope, but to let them be and to witness their continued being. To someone who therefore limits himself to giving them the hollow, the free space they ask for in return, the resonance they require, who follows their own movement, who is therefore not a nothingness the full being would come to stop up, but a question consonant with the porous being which it questions, and from which it obtains not an answer, but a confirmation of its astonishment. It is necessary to comprehend perception as this an interrogative thought which lets the perceived world be rather than posits it, before which the things form and undo themselves in a sort of gliding beneath the yes and the no. So I'll just point out three main ideas that kind of leapt out at me from that quote. There's no full, complete answer to the philosophical question. There's no solution. I've talked about that a lot. Merleau-Ponty emphasizes that here. Being and the thing appear only through perspectives. So that is to say, if that's the case, then there are always other perspectives which are occluded. So being and the thing always appear with those things I talked about before, gaps, lacunae, fissures. They always appear hollow. There's always emptiness. There are always blank spaces in the canvas. And it must be that way. That is what it is to be a world. So I like that Merleau-Ponty's expression here. It's being in the thing itself appear not to someone who wishes to hold them as with forceps, immobilize them, as under a microscope, but someone who's able to let them be the way they are, let them be with those gaps, with those fissures, not to have a complete, perfect mathematical description or explanation, not because it's beyond us or that's the prerogative of God or something, but because it's impossible. There is no, that kind of absolute knowledge defeats the whole point. Not defeats the whole point, it renders knowledge impossible. To have that kind to want to have that kind of certitude, that kind of fixity in your understanding is to want something that is not the world. It's to want a part of the world, a little corner that you can isolate from everything else, and give as thorough a description as you can. But that it will always, there's always a wider world around that little corner you've sectioned off that is going to be unknown, or that is going to be full of unanswered questions. And finally, to grasp being and the thing, one must not appear as a constituting subject. So who we are, we can't be a constituting subject, which would put us above the world, give us that aerial view that Merleau-Ponty talks about. Nor can we be a nothingness, which the world could fill up. Rather, we must be a questioning, an interrogation that is as insubstantial, i.e. not complete, i.e. not substance, not a thing, as insubstantial as the being that it questions. So we must be of the same kind of thing as the being that we are open to. And that's another link to, or a foreshadowing, if you like, of the idea of the chiasm, which we'll talk about later. But that's just a little sampler of how, not just how the world is, but how we are, such that we can be open to the world in this way. And all of this brings us back to language. So this interrogation that we're talking about, this interrogation that goes beyond what one can speak of, before our experience has been reduced to a set of manageable, disposable significations, before reflection. And it goes beyond this because the examination of the significations in themselves would give us only the world reduced to our idealizations and our syntax. Instead of asking the question or interrogating through significations like language, we have to ask the question to what Merleau-Ponty calls our mute life. We want to go before language. We have to understand how the world, how being is prior to language, because language arises within the world. And it always fixes the world in certain ways. Signification always crystallizes the world in a certain way. It always, in trying to understand the world, it operates with terms, i.e. signifiers, that close off the world, that close off our openness to the world. So it's like a catch-22. That's the problem that Merleau-Ponty is dealing with here. We have to understand the world that we want to understand is prior to language, but the only access we have is through language, which as soon as it's used, changes the world, alters the world, fixes it in certain forms and shapes, articulates it in certain ways. So how can we get access to this mute life? And this is like I said, the paradox for Merleau-Ponty. What philosophy finds, it says. It uses language to explain. It is itself a human construction, and the philosopher knows very well that whatever be his effort, in the best of cases it will take its place among the artifacts and products of culture as an instance of them. If this paradox is not an impossibility, and if philosophy can speak, it is because language is not only the depository of fixed and acquired significations, because one speaks not only of what one knows so as to set out a display of it, but also of what one does not know in order to know it, and because language in forming itself expresses, at least laterally, an ontogenesis of which it is a part. But from this it follows that the words most charged with philosophy are not necessarily those that contain what they say, but rather those that most energetically open upon being. So every philosophy must express itself somehow, and in doing so it belongs to a history, an era, an epoch, a culture, whatever word you want to use for that. In expressing itself, it uses language, and language is always restrictive. It always closes down that openness that we're trying to uncover. So what makes philosophy work, basically, for Merleau-Ponty, is the fact that, as we've seen, language is not a depository of fixed and acquired significations. It's not a set of one-to-one correspondences that we can trot out that we can put on display to show what is happening internally. It's not an external show that merely mirrors or replicates an original internal production. Rather, it's the working out of thought itself. And that's what Merleau-Ponty means when he says one speaks not only of what one knows, but in order to know it. So language, because it's not this fixed set of correspondences, this system which merely codifies or indexes something that is prior to it, but it's a part of the forming of that something which is prior to it, something which is original, that origin. It's a part of that articulation of being. It's a part of those structural laws, those powers that we talked about earlier that allow the world to be a world. And because of that, it gives us this avenue, this opening through which we can get to this deeper openness, this ontological foundation. But in order to do that, we need to know how we are using our words. We need to use our words in careful ways. We need to be aware of the way that words have been formed and how they restrict our thought. Because if we're aware of that, then we can use them in this, we can take advantage of the fact that they aren't one-to-one correspondences, that there is ambiguity in language. And we can use that in order to better understand or to even to develop our ideas about being. So, Merleau-Ponty says the most important words of philosophy aren't those that contain what they say, i.e. it's not those that have that rigid, fixed, one-to-one correspondence, that don't add anything to your thought, to discourse, that merely codify what you already had worked out. It's not those words that are important for philosophy. Rather, it's those that most energetically open upon being, i.e. those that are able to, we could say, trace those articulations that give rise to the world and to things. Those invisible and, to a certain point, inexpressible terms that mark out how we are articulating being to such that there is being, such that there is a world. And what Merleau-Ponty means by words that don't contain what they say is not nonsense words. It's not gibberish. It's not trying to confuse and befuddle. And it's certainly not like a Buddhist style koan type of situation. What's the sound of one hand clapping? It's not that kind of thing. Rather, he means words whose meaning overflows that one-to-one relation. And he gives us a couple of examples of this. Later we'll talk about the chiasm. He's already talked about flesh. Heidegger has done the same with attunement, being toward death, ontic. These words all escape an easy definition. Difference, repetition, Deleuze. Difference, trace, Derrida. All of these words are examples of ways of making you think. These are words that you don't read, and you can't just read and easily understand what they're saying, because the words themselves, the words that these philosophers are using, aren't easily understandable. That they don't fit into this. They don't have an easy corresponding signified. You have to work for them. You have to work to understand what they mean. And that's not because these philosophers are trying to, they're not manipulating you, or they're not deliberately writing obtusely. It's because the subject matter they're writing about isn't the kind of thing that can be explicated in a fixed, coherent, perfectly ordered system. The thing we're trying to understand is full of holes. It's incomplete, necessarily so. It's a questioning. It's an interrogation. It responds to interrogation. It's the thing that's being questioned has the same nature as the questioning itself. And this ambiguity, this dynamism, perhaps, would be a good word. This being, world, this is not something that admits of a simple textbook articulation. It requires this. In order to get to it, you have to move a little bit obliquely, because the thing you're trying to understand is oblique. Yeah. So that's kind of the idea with this, anyway. And for me, it just makes so much sense. Ironically, given that it shouldn't, but it's not that it shouldn't make sense, but it's that the thing we're trying to understand, it's not this clear thing. And if you've ever read Heidegger, and probably many of you have, you'll know this. It's not when you first come across the word attunement in Heidegger, you don't understand exactly what he means. You have to read that definition again and again and again, and the next time he uses it, you have to say, hold on, what does achievement mean again? You go back to the definition, and the definition still doesn't make sense because it's not something you can just grasp and hold on to. It's more nebulous than that. It refers to other things. It has multiple references. It's a tough idea to grasp. Ontic is the same. Ontic and ontological. It took me ages to grasp those, and I only grasped them after engaging with the text for a period of time, after reading and rereading and reading again these words, seeing them in context, seeing how Heidegger used them. That's the only way to understand these words. If you look for a definition, you might get one, but that's not the core of the core meaning of the word. It doesn't get you to an understanding of the word, because these words make use of that ambiguity that's inherent in language, that way that words open up to capture multiple relations, the way that they transcend their own fixity, they transcend the system of which they're a part in a way. But, and I should also mention, I mentioned it before, I did mention it, but I'll just want to emphasize it. It's not that, I don't think the right way to think of this is as philosophers as gurus, right? They're not writing these books in such a way that you are being drawn to some revelation or anything. That's kind of a spiritualistic kind of, guru-ish way of thinking of them. And it's not that at all, I don't believe. It's just that when they're trying to explain these ideas, they have to use language in this way because it's the only way you can explain these ideas. They're not looking down on you from a perch, as a guru, kind of crafting their text in such a way that you are slowly enlightened, you slowly become enlightened as you're reading. I don't think that's the right way to think about it. But like I say, it's the nature of the beast. It's the way you have to write if you want to write about this topic, the world, being. This is the only way to do it. And so Merleau-Ponty goes on to ask, how should language be used? And there are two options. The first he calls the eloquent language. And this, I think, is, I think this is what he means by this: regular prose, just used creatively. So this would be all of those words that we talked about before: being and time, phenomenology of perception. Yeah, it's in there, right? Difference in repetition, Derrida and all of the things that he's written of grammatology and all of the rest, all of those essays that he wrote. Any philosopher who investigates this and writes a philosophy book, have written using what Merleau-Ponty calls eloquent language, I believe. And the other way, the second option, is language that has been stripped of its power of immediate or direct signification. And by that, I think he means poetry, metaphor, that kind of thing. Perhaps literature, so novels and things, that probably falls into this category as well. But that's it's not a philosophy textbook as such. It's not a book like Being and Nothingness or Being and Time. Now we're starting to talk about art. So, like I say, poetry, metaphor, using language in ways in which we're not really trying to directly convey an idea. We're really taking the long route, if you like. But that's what I think he means by those. He doesn't fully explain it. Eloquent language and language which has been stripped of its power of immediate or direct signification. That's what I think he means. The first philosophy textbooks that are dense and difficult to read, and second, poetry, metaphor, literature. And interestingly, Merleau-Ponty leaves this question unanswered as to which is the best way, or which is the most effective, or the only way, or maybe both are okay. Who knows? So finally, Merleau-Ponty asks, well, he doesn't ask this directly, but he questions or brings up who we are in this philosophy of interrogation. Who is it that is the interrogator, the questioner? And he starts by saying, we don't have a consciousness constitutive of the thing. This would be idealism. Nor do we have a preordination of the thing to consciousness, which would be realism. Instead, we have with our body, our senses, our look, our power to understand speech and to speak, measurements for being, dimensions to which we can refer it, but not a relation of adequation or of immanence. So back to Merleau-Ponty's good old-fashioned, what he did in Phenomenology of Perception, that rejection of realism and idealism. And is it a middle path, perhaps, in one sense? So rather than being a fixed or substantial thing, we are a body, senses, a look, a capacity to speak, which measure out of being dimensions which enable a relation to being, but a relation that is never complete or adequate. So we're not a fixed thing. We're not a subject. We're not a consciousness. We're not a mind. We're not a body as science would understand us. We are this capacity to measure in being, measure dimensions which bring about a relation to being, which bring about, therefore, a world. And so I quite like that idea, the fact that we are this way of understanding what it is to be a human being is we are we are measurements for being, but measurements that are never able to fully measure being, to fully grasp it. Not because we lack something, or we're not smart enough, or this is the realm of this is only God can know being like this. Because if you could measure being out perfectly, it would disappear. You would lose being. There would be no world. And so that's a nice way of thinking about it, I think. And an analogy that came to mind here is dark matter. So we only know dark matter is there by the way that it affects regular matter, the way that its gravitational pull means that regular matter, for example, as it's spinning in a galaxy, for example, spins faster than it should, given the amount of regular matter that we can see. So we can infer that there must be this other dark matter. And that's kind of the way that we know being. We can understand this invisible, because it's in the title, right? We can understand this invisible framework by tracing out those articulations in the world. We can get a glimpse of the framework that has that those articulations kind of move through. The way we get to see this invisible framework by observing the visible traces that make the world. So we are thrust into the middle of the world, not as a thing or as a nothing, but as interrogation. If we are ourselves in question in the very unfolding of our life, it is not because a central non-being threatens to revoke our consent to being at each instant. It is because we ourselves are one sole continued question, a perpetual enterprise of taking our bearings on the constellations of the world, and of taking the bearings of the things on our dimensions. So we aren't things. Like I said before, we're not a subject, a consciousness, a mind, a spirit, none of those things. We are measurements for or interrogations of being. And this is not because there's a non-being lurking in the basement of ontology, for example, ready to cancel being at any time. Remember what we talked about earlier in this series, the fragility of the real. A perception can only break up with the appearance of a new reality. So it's not that there's non-being, there's always being, but it might just be a different being than the one that you originally thought it was. And what we've talked about in this video, we can't terminate our look, we can only displace it. But we are always looking. So there is no non-being lurking to cancel, to revoke our consent to being. Rather, it is this way. We are what we are because we are a continual question. We are a continual interrogation on being. We are an interpretation of being. And this is a good example, right, of a word that doesn't contain what it says. The way that Merleau-Ponty uses this word question or interrogation here. To say that we are an interrogation is exactly that kind of oblique referencing that Merleau-Ponty was talking about, using words in ways that create new ideas, that generate new thoughts. The word doesn't explicitly refer to one thing. You have to access the word, you have to see it in context, and you probably have to read it more than once in order to understand what he's talking about when he uses it, interrogation. And it's that lets us overcome this the problem that words are always second order worlds. Language is always a second order world. It's always within the world, and it always restricts being. If we want to get to that openness, we have to use words in this way that bring us out, that make us think, that force us to understand in a different way. And that's I think what Merleau-Ponty's getting at. Anyway, that's where I'm going to finish. So let's have a look at a summary. First up, we looked at language. And the question was really here, is language the meaning of our question before the world? So we define language first. We define what it isn't. It's not a system of inert signs. It's not a one-to-one correspondence. It's not a fixed, whole, harmonious system like this. There's ambiguity. It's a messy process. It's not clear. It's not tidy. And language is itself a world or a being. And Merleau-Ponty said here, it's a world and a being to the second power. And this means that it's a part of the world. And this means that it therefore isn't the meaning of our question before the world. Arising within it, it doesn't get us to this deeper understanding Merleau-Ponty's after. For that, we have to move to the next part of the video, which is the horizon. And the basic idea here is that the world always exists as a horizon. So being in and of the world, as evidenced by the fact that we can only ever displace our look, it never disappears, or there's never some other form of access. We are always looking. Being in and of the world like this means that the world must be horizontal. It must be a horizon around us that always surrounds us. And then we looked at interrogation, the third part. So philosophy, the goal of philosophy is to interrogate the world and the thing. So not to find a solution. That's kind of an important point there. It's an interrogation, not to find a solution, because there is no solution. Because to solve this problem would be to eliminate everything. It would be to eliminate the very thing we're trying to understand. Rather, philosophy discerns invisible articulations in the world. Merleau-Ponty called these structural laws, those powers that show the world according to a style. That's what philosophy looks to uncover. And that gets us back to this deeper ontological framework that Merleau-Ponty's after. So it's not related to cognition. Cognition turns unknowns into knowns, but being and world require unknowns. They require lacunae. They require gaps, fissures. There has to be uncertainty and areas that are not filled in. If you completely fill in the world, it's no longer a world. And then this brought us back full circle to language and the way that philosophy uses words that don't contain what they say. Gets around, it's able to get around the impossibility, the inexpressibility of being through the fact that language doesn't have this one-to-one perfectly ordered, systematic structure, that there is ambiguity necessarily in language. So philosophy is able to take advantage of that, use words that don't contain what they say, which is not to say using nonsense words, but words that overflow these one-to-one relations, words that make use of multiple references, words that mean something only within the context that they're being used. For example, chiasm, although we haven't talked about that yet, but flesh, we've talked about flesh in Merleau-Ponty, and I gave a whole bunch of other examples from other philosophers. You don't have to look far to find examples of those. And we concluded with a look at ourselves. We are, Merleau-Ponty says, measurements for being, interrogations of being. So not a subject, not a consciousness, not a mind, not a body, but measurements that trace out articulations within being, that trace out dimensions in being. And that's an important word in Merleau-Ponty here. But we are these measurements, but at the same time, we're measurements that can never adequately and perfectly explicate being, precisely because we are a part of it. We are in it and we are of it, and we can never grasp it in its totality, because to do so, if it were possible, even if it were possible, to grasp it like that would be to eliminate it. And that's us for today. So that's the end of this chapter, the second chapter. Next video we'll start on the third chapter. But yeah, I'm really enjoying this, having to go through the book like this, and I'm getting a lot out of it, more out of it than I did when I first read it, which is good. And hopefully you're getting as much out of it as I am. Thanks for watching, as always, and I'll see you next time.